Good morning, everyone. What we're going to do today is we're really just going to wrap up what we didn't get a chance to finish on Friday from the Second Great Awakening, and really kind of touch on some of the subjects that we looked at the end, but really didn't go into in any real depth. And then what we're also going to take a look at is some of the reform movements, kind of introduce the reform movements, and really focus a lot on the women's role in reform, because women are playing a huge role throughout the 1820s and 1830s. Women are getting very involved in trying to reform society and fix the social ills that they see out there in American communities. So what we're going to start off with is basically these utopian societies that start to pop up throughout America, but primarily, if you look at the map here, primarily they're popping up in upstate New York, like the burned over district, some in New England, but specifically in New England, it's like the Shakers over here. Then also out here in the what we would call the Midwest, but was really the New West at the time, and is primarily like the Great Lakes region of the United States. So some of these different, what they're trying to do out here is they're trying to create utopian societies. So they feel that the Eastern societies, the more established communities, the cities of America, are becoming way too corrupt. And what they have to do to kind of almost purify themselves is to leave the corrupt, industrialized cities and areas of America and kind of go out and form their own societies, basically kind of like shut off, almost like closed, gated communities. So some of the famous people who do this, the first famous person that tries this is a guy named Robert Owen, and he's going to go out and he's going to try and form a society called New Harmony. And the whole idea here is that they're really going to try and share everything equally. So people are going to farm together and work together. And so what this is called is utopian socialism. And their whole idea here is to work together and kind of leave behind all of what they see as the ills of capitalism and the problems of capitalism. Now, this is really interesting because all of these communities out here are religiously based, and they do have a lot of ideas of what, like, modern people would look back and look at these and say that they're very socialistic or they're very communist. But they're getting their inspiration not from, say, Karl Marx, because Karl Marx didn't write his famous manifesto yet. They're getting their inspiration from the Bible because they're looking back and saying, well, in the Bible says everyone is equal, so therefore we should treat everybody equally. And they feel like capitalism and like the new industrial America is kind of basically taking the religion out of the society and kind of taking them away from religious values and pushing them more towards capitalistic values, which they don't see kind of coinciding. So you have some other people who are going to try and do these utopian societies, and they're popping up all over the country. Now, some of them succeed, but most of them don't really last for an extended period of time. Like, for example, New Harmony, it only lasts for about 2 years, and it kind of goes financially bankrupt. But I think the important thing about these societies is that people are trying to fix society, that they're trying to reform it, and they kind of see the more established places in America as becoming too corrupt, and that like industrialization, although it's bringing progress in some ways, and industrialists are going to say it's bringing civilization, it's making America progress. These guys are also going to say, well, it's bringing all of these negative things that are bringing our society down and weighing our society down. And increasingly, more and more people are going to get involved with this whole idea that there's too much what you would call almost like dirt in society. And the evangelicals want to kind of clean up America and kind of bring it back to a purer age. So that's when we're going to kind of get into some of the effects of the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening has huge social effects. So when we talked about the First Great Awakening, it has some social effects, the First Great Awakening, but it probably has more, it definitely has religious effects, obviously, but it probably has more political effects, the First Great Awakening, than the Second Great Awakening does. But the Second Great Awakening has huge social effects. So in the base level, what happens here is that you see an explosion of different types of denominations. So if you look at this graph really kind of gives you some nice figures here of different groups and how many different types of groups are kind of coming into America at the time. And what you should notice here is that there's kind of an explosion after 1820 of different denominations in America. So just to review what denomination means. Denomination means that it's a different version of Christianity coming into the United States. And so really in Protestantism, you really only see denominations in the Protestant religion. In Catholicism, there are no denominations. In the Eastern Orthodox Christianity, there are no denominations. But in Protestantism, since different groups can interpret the Bible for themselves, sometimes they disagree with each other, and what happens is they start to form their own different version of the Protestant religion. So you have, the Calvinists, the Baptists, the Congregationalists, the Episcopalians, the Lutherans, these different types of Protestantism. And so when the Second Great Awakening comes out, and people have this new wave of evangelicalism, what starts to happen is that people start to sometimes break away from even, from the more traditional branches of Protestantism and form their own new version of Christianity, because there's certain things that they might not agree with. So like the Mormons are a good example of that, and some other groups that kind of come out here in the Second Great Awakening. So this is actually just the religious effects, but when you look at this, it has much bigger social implications. So the big idea that kind of comes out of this, and it grows out of the religious fervor, is that you can fix the problems of society. Just like you can fix your soul and you kind of reform your soul, like the evangelicals are preaching here in the Second Great Awakening, you can also kind of look at your own society and fix it. So it's not trying to use government to fix it, or trying to get, the national government or the state government to fix social problems and kind of clean up society. They kind of take it upon themselves, and they're going to try and fix it themselves. And so a lot of preachers are going to kind of lead movements like Lyman Beecher, but more common than that is you're going to have a lot of women getting involved in reform movements. And what they're trying to do is really, it kind of plays into the role that people see women playing during the era, that women are supposed to kind of be the guardians of your soul, but also kind of like domestic life. And so it's almost kind of like them, think of it almost kind of like women in a sense being like mothers for the society, and they have to kind of like clean up their society. And so women become very active in the different reform movements that are going to pop up out of the Second Great Awakening. So you have religious elements to it, you have women really being involved with it, and then you have other people who just kind of latch on to certain causes and kind of want to get involved. So what you see here, women, there's different reform movements. So you have temperance movement, prison reform. The huge one is going to be abolition. That is going to kind of pop out of this movement. But what they're going to do really is they're going to basically create organizations. So like the American temperance movement. And so it's basically all volunteerism, American volunteerism. And so when we read de Tocqueville, when he comes to America, this is the era that de Tocqueville comes to America in. And so one of the comments that he makes about America is that all Americans seem to belong to some kind of organization, some kind of voluntary organization, that they love to kind of like meet in communities and meet in groups and try and work for their communities and fix problems in their communities. And that's one of the huge comments that he makes. And it's kind of, throughout his book about the United States, that this is something that like characterizes Americans as a people, that they don't kind of sit there complacently and just let problems persist, and they don't look to somebody else to kind of fix their problems. They're willing to kind of get out there and do it themselves, and there's this real sense that you can fix and you can improve your own society. Now, the big reform movement, we're going to talk about some of the other ones on Monday in class, but the big reform movement that pops out of this is going to be the abolitionist movement to end slavery. Now, naturally, kind of from women being so involved in these reform movements, what's going to happen is that women are going to kind of see that there needs to be reform in regards to them also, not just in these other areas of society. So one of the last kind of movements that kind of comes from this whole era is actually going to be the women's rights movement. And so it's the early women's rights movement, because this is going to kind of span here. So this starts in the 1840s. Now, women don't really achieve their goal as far as women's rights are concerned until the 1920s. So it takes a good 80 years for them to accomplish their goals. What you're looking at here are a few of the famous people, famous early leaders of the women's rights movement. So you have over here, this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So she's one of the really early leaders, and she's going to be with the women's rights movement up into, into Reconstruction era, up into the 1880s. You have Lucretta Mott, who's a Quaker, And she's also a big leader. She was a big part of abolitionism, and she kind of like segued into women's rights. The same thing with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. A lot of these leaders, they start with abolitionism, and they're going to move into women's rights. This last woman over here is Susan B. Anthony. So eventually, when women get the right to vote, they nicknamed the amendment the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So she's also very instrumental in starting early organizations for women and kind of getting women's rights out there. Now, at this time, they're really not, when they first start this movement, it's not so necessarily about voting. It's just about kind of gaining more rights and more equality for women, in general. Now, some other people get involved. So like I said, the women's rights movement really grows from the anti-slavery movement, from the abolitionist movement. So these two women are also pretty instrumental in it. You have Sarah and Angelina Grimke. So these two women are Southerners, actually, and they kind of go on like a speaking tour throughout the North, kind of talking about the evils of slavery. Now, what starts to kind of get women to move not away from the abolitionist movement, but kind of also look for their own rights, is they see parallels between slave situation and their own situation. And they kind of see the fact that, well, they have very little political rights in America at the time as well. And so some of them make the comments that they're also kind of in chains, that they're in shackles, that they can't kind of express themselves freely. And it's not just the fact that they don't have the right to vote. It's also the fact that they live in a very patriarchal society. That, the male-dominated society kind of marginalizes women, and they don't really treat them as equals, social equals, political equals, and they really can't get their voices heard the way that they'd like them to be heard. So what really kind of gives them a wake-up call is that two women that we talked about earlier. So you have Lucretta Mott and not Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They win seats, American seats, to go to the International Abolitionist Congress, basically, which they're talking about trying to abolish slavery throughout the entire world, and it's held in England. Now, when they go there, they refuse to seat them in the Congress because they're women. And so this kind of like lights a fire under them and kind of spurs them to fight for their own rights. And so the culmination of this in this early era is going to be the Seneca Falls Convention. So this is led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton primarily, and it's held up actually in upstate New York. So we're talking about that burned over district up in western New York. So in 1848, now the big product of this, she gives a speech at the Seneca Falls Convention, and her speech is called the Declaration of the Rights of Women and Sentiments. And really in this speech, she's going to spell out kind of the injustices that she thinks women have been facing for generations in American society. And really what she does is she starts to give some direction to the women's rights movement. And so really what they start to do is kind of like take it in the direction of, we're trying to gain the right to vote. We want to gain equality. We want to get political equality. Because you think about it, America, that's the core of America. Kind of gaining political equality, getting your right to vote. That's really how you gain equality in the United States. And so this is an important early meeting for the women's rights movement. Now, overall, the women's rights movement doesn't really take off in this era. It's very much overshadowed by abolitionism. So you have the other reform movements going on at the same time, which some of them get more publicity than the women's rights movement as well. So you have temperance and other things that are happening, but really, slavery dominates the antebellum period. And so you can't escape it. And so women's rights really kind of takes a back seat to this whole situation with slavery. Now, women as a whole at the time, you have certain women who are kind of becoming more feminist, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other people who are trying to kind of get out there as far as voting rights. But on the flip side, what you also have is this idea known as the cult of domesticity. That really is more prevalent, that permeates kind of women's mentality at the time. And it's a really interesting belief. The belief is that women are kind of purer and more religious and more holy than men. And so therefore what they have to do is really kind of be the guardians of men's souls and their children's souls. And it's kind of like elevating motherhood to this really important level. And kind of that, women working in the homes are playing a huge role, a very, very important role for society. So we'll talk a little bit more about this on Monday. I'm running out of time, so I'll see you guys on Monday.